One of the things that we often forget to do when we start to study a book of the Bible is we just kind of like to dive in and often not stop to think about the book as a whole. So we're going to think about the book as a whole first before we dive into it. And the first principle we're going to talk about is this idea of genre. So the drawing, to help you remember this, so each principle has a drawing, and the goal of this is so that you can be at a restaurant, you can be at your dinner table, and even on a napkin, you can use these drawings to help people remember things, you know. So you're talking about it, you're drawing it for the visual learners, you're practicing it, and all these things help us remember. So, all right, I'm not a very good drawer, but so here we have an apple, a banana, and a pineapple. All right, now each of those is a fruit, right? They're all fruit, but we don't eat them all the same, right? I doubt lately you've just grabbed a pineapple and just taken a big, just bite out of it, right? Every fruit has to be prepared differently in order to ingest it and really get the nutrients out of it, right? And the same way, the idea of genre is that the whole Bible, 66 books that God has inspired, is all literature. It's all fruit, it's all literature. But within that category of literature, there are different genres, right? And genres are just different types of literature. And we have that, outside the Bible, right? We have poetry and we have comic books. They're different forms of literature, right? We have autobiographies and we have science fiction novels, right? They're different genres. And with each genre, there's kind of different things you're looking for when you read it, and you come to it with kind of some different kind of tools in your brain to make sure you're understanding it, right? So the book of Habakkuk that we're in is focusing on the genre of what? What genre is it? Prophets, I heard. Yes. All right. So when we think about the prophets, what we often think about is here's the prophet, and we frequently tend to think the prophet is fixated on the future, right? That's what we mostly tend to think about. And there is some truth to that, but it's actually a much bigger picture than that. Prophets are interested in speaking to the present, right? So the people of God in the present, where they're at. So they want to address them. And what they're often doing, though, is they're actually looking back to the past where God's covenant is. So I'll just kind of draw the two tablets here. So they're focused on the covenant. And they're looking back to what God has called his people to be and do. So looking back to that initial covenant, and then they're applying that covenant to the people of today, of their time period, and saying, based off this and how your actions are, this is what your future looks like. So they're much less about predicting the future, although they do some of that, right? God inspires them to do that, as they are more like covenant enforcers or police officers. They're coming along and saying, hey, you're messing up. Here's how you're messing up. Because remember what God called us to do back here. And this is what you're doing right now. And so this is what's going to happen in the future. And often that future has both judgment and rescue in view, right? Because no matter how messed up God's people are, God's always going to be faithful to his promises. So you tend to see this pattern of, here's what God called us to do. We're not doing it. Judgment's going to happen. But because God is a promise-keeping God, he's going to still find a way to keep his promises to us. So there's going to be a rescue on the other side of judgment. That's often what kind of the prophets are doing. And so what that means is if we really want to dig into a prophetic book, we need to understand kind of all three of these dimensions, all right? So we need to understand what's going on in the present in order to really make sense of their message. So how do you think we would try to understand what's going on in the present situation that the prophet's speaking to? How would you try to figure that out? And you can't say, Google it or use a study Bible, all right? Which study Bibles are off use today. There's a great place for study Bibles, but sometimes we go too quickly to just getting the answer fed to us, and I want us to try to practice today trying to find the answers ourselves. Now, if on your own study you get stuck or there's things you don't know, that's when a study Bible is very useful, where commentaries are useful, dictionaries. Like, go to them. Once you kind of try to take a first pass and you're like, hey, this is the things I still don't understand, that's when those resources are helpful. But for today, let's try to avoid that. So using just your Bible, how would you try to figure out what's going on in the prophet's own time period?
There's lot of cross-references to other books of the Bible.
There's a lot of cross-references. That's a great point, right? So oftentimes there's cross-references in our Bibles, right, where it might help us. And oftentimes in the prophets, they're going to cross-reference to what, probably? The historical books. Yep.
Like what's happening during that time.
Exactly. So a great way to know what's going on in this time period is once you get some clues from within the book, like sometimes the prophets will mention the names of kings, right? Like the prophet Isaiah was during the time of these kings, right? Okay, well now with the names of those kings, you could use your cross-reference, go back to the books of 1st, 2nd Kings or 1st, 2nd Chronicles and read about what's going on in that time period, right? And it really wouldn't take you that long to do, but it would help you get a better understanding of kind of what's going on, right? And it's just a very simple tip to try to get your head around what's going on. So let's just look at the first 6 verses of Habakkuk together for a second. We're going to do this as a group exercise. And just see, because we want to probably read the book of the prophet first to see if there's some clues, and then that might lead us back to Kings or Chronicles. So in the first 6 verses, let me read them, and then let's just see if there's any clues as to what's going on in that time period. So I'm reading from the ESV this morning. The oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity? Why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me, strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. Look among the nations and see. Wonder and be astounded. For I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, or Babylonians is how a lot of other translations put it, that bitter and hasty nation who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. All right, so what are some clues we have just in these first 6 verses that help us know what's going on in this time period? Just call them out.
The Babylonians have power.
The Babylonians have power, yeah, and they're about to come, right? So it's sometime before the Babylonians come and invade the southern kingdom of Judah, right? So that gives us a clue as to where we are in the story. So in case you don't remember, about 1000 BC, David becomes king. His son Solomon becomes king. His son Rehoboam, the kingdom splits into 2. You have the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Now the northern kingdom gets wiped out by the Assyrians. And then eventually the southern kingdom, if you read in 2 Kings, gets wiped out by the Babylonians. So we're probably in the time period where the north has already been conquered by the Assyrians, but we're not quite at the spot where the south gets conquered by the Babylonians. That's probably the time period we're at, just because if he's about to raise up the Babylonians, that would be right about where it's going on. All right, are there any other clues as to what's going on? A lot of injustice, yep. Mm-hmm. And yep, sorry. A lot of violence, yep. And who's doing this injustice and violence? The people around him, his own people, right? This isn't the Babylonians, because they're not here yet, right? God's about to raise them. This is God's own people that are doing this, right? So we have some clues here that they're doing evil, injustice, right? Verse 4, the law is paralyzed, right? So there's a sense where Habakkuk is realizing his own people are being evil, right? And if we were to go back to, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, we could read about this, right? For the sake of time today, we won't. But you could go back and see how the kings are not worshiping God, right? In fact, there's one king in particular, Manasseh, in the south of Judah, who puts idols in the temple. So literally building other idols to other gods in the temple for the Lord, right? Jeremiah is around this time, right? I forget the name of the king he's with. I'm blanking out right now. But that king, at one point, when Baruch brings Jeremiah's words to him, the king literally starts slicing the scroll into strips as Baruch's giving one page of the scroll at a time and throwing it in the fire. That's how little he cares about God's words, right? I mean, this is not a good time, right? So that's what's going on in the time period of kind of Habakkuk. And we got to understand that The main problem Habakkuk's seeing that he's trying to address is first the evil in his own people. Otherwise, we're going to miss what's going on in this book. Now, as I said, we also want to understand the past. We want to understand how the prophets are understanding the covenant that God made with his people. Now, there's a lot of spots you could go back to find that, right? The law in Exodus, the giving of the covenant, Deuteronomy. But in fact, there's a couple chapters in Deuteronomy that are particularly helpful. Chapters 27 and 28 of Deuteronomy, if you want to flip there for a minute. But this is where God basically, it's actually mostly chapter 28, I should say. God basically lays out and says, okay, here's all the blessings that will happen if you keep the covenant. And here's all the curses that will happen if you don't keep the covenant. And Deuteronomy 28 is kind of like a central hub. If you can imagine transit stations or bus stations, right? Sometimes you'll flights, right? If you're flying out of, Milwaukee and you want to go somewhere far, they might fly you to a more of a hub city and then you fly overseas, right? So Deuteronomy 28 is like a hub for the covenant. And so it's a great chapter just to learn. But I want us to just look at a couple verses here in chapter 28, verses 45 to 59. And then I want us to look at the verses 6 through 11 of chapter 1 of Habakkuk and just see if you can see some echoes here and see how in this book of Habakkuk, it really is drawing on this covenant language back here. So let me read verses 45 to 59. All these curses shall come upon you and pursue you and overtake you till you are destroyed, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord your God to keep his commandments and his statutes that he commanded you. They shall be a sign and a wonder against you and your offspring forever, because you did not serve the Lord your God with joyfulness and gladness of heart, because of the abundance of all things. Therefore you shall serve your enemies, whom the Lord will send against you, in hunger and thirst, in nakedness and lacking everything. And he will put a yoke of iron on your neck until he has destroyed you. The Lord will bring a nation against you from far away, from the end of the earth, swooping down like the eagle, a nation whose language you do not understand, a hard-faced nation who shall not respect the old or show mercy to the young. It shall eat the offspring of your cattle and the fruit of your ground until you are destroyed. It also shall not leave you grain, wine, or oil, the increase of your herds or the young of your flock, until they have caused you to perish. They shall besiege you in all your towns until your high and fortified walls in which you trusted come down throughout all your land. And they shall besiege you in all your towns throughout all your land, which the Lord your God has given you. And you shall eat the fruit of your womb, the flesh of your sons and daughters, whom the Lord your God has given you, in the siege and in the distress with which your enemies shall distress you. The man who's the most tender and refined among you will begrudge food to his brother, to the wife he embraces, and to the last of the children whom he has left. So he will not give to any of them any of the flesh of his children whom he is eating, because he has nothing else left in the siege and in the distress with which your enemy shall distress you in all your towns. The most tender and refined woman among you, who would not venture to set the sole of her foot on the ground because she is so delicate and tender, will begrudge to the husband she embraces, to her son and to her daughter, her afterbirth that comes out from between her feet, and her children whom she bears, because lacking everything she will eat them secretly in the siege and in the distress with which your enemy shall distress you in your towns. If you are not careful to do all the words of this law that are written in this book, that you may fear this glorious and awesome name, the Lord your God, then the Lord will bring on you and your offspring extraordinary afflictions, afflictions severe and lasting, and sicknesses grievous and lasting. All right, so these are some heavy words, right? If you read about the siege of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, this literally happened. They literally were cannibalizing and eating some of their own children when they were running out of food. So this happened, which is crazy. But flip over back to Habakkuk 1, but keep your finger in Deuteronomy 28. And does somebody want to read verses 6 to 11 of chapter 1 for us? And let's just see if there's any language that you pick up on that sounds familiar. Someone want to read that for us? All right, Andy?
For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swift to devour. They all come for violence, all their faces forward. They gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. Then they sweep by like the wind and go on. Guilty men, whose own might is their God.
All right. Does any language kind of echo from Deuteronomy 28? Did you catch any echoes there? Kind of maybe glance back and forth and see if there's some phrases or images that pop up. The eagle, yes, right? So in Deuteronomy 20 he says, this nation will like an eagle come flying in, and that's how the Babylonians are described, right? So he's picking up and saying, this isn't going to be a random thing that's happening. This is what I told you is going to happen, right? Yep. Anything else?
The idea of like a fortress or a fortified wall not being enough to protect you.
Yeah, exactly, right? So again, we've got this similar language, and what that's meant to do is it's meant to connect in the listeners of that day. What's about to happen to you in the future isn't a random thing. It's not just God flying off the handle because he lost it that day. He told you it was going to happen way back then, and you just wouldn't keep listening, and so now it's coming. Flip over to Habakkuk 3 for a second, too. Does someone want to read verse 17? And again, see if there's some echoes to the curses from Deuteronomy 28. So Habakkuk 3:17. Can somebody read that for us? All right, back there.
Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the field yield no food. The flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stall.
Yeah. Does any of that language sound familiar from something we read in Deuteronomy 28? There's no food, yeah, right? Verse 51 of Deuteronomy 28. They shall eat the offspring of your cattle and the fruit of your ground. They shall not leave you grain or wine or oil, right? So again, this language of the destruction that's coming is pulling from Deuteronomy 28. I just want you to see that because, again, what that tells us is what God, through Habakkuk, is saying is, remember all the stuff I told you way back here? Well, in light of what you're doing now, this is what's going to come. And I think that helps us because it's really important to see that God's judgment in Habakkuk is not God just flying off the handle, right? It's more like in parenting where your kid is like, I'm going to go do this. And you're like, okay, if you go do that, it's disobedience, and you know that the consequence is you're not going to have any screen time tomorrow. And they're like, too bad, and then they go off and do it. And so then you take away their screen time, and then can you imagine if they go around to all their friends and they're like, you wouldn't believe how mean my mom and dad are, right? But like sometimes we want to do that with God, but when we see how he's tying this into the covenant, it helps us see, no, this is more like the parenting situation, right? And so it helps us just have a bit of context to see what's going on here, right? This is a long story of God's patience that's coming to bear here. Now, the last thing I'll mention real quick is what about the future? And the future, you can think about it like a series of mountain peaks, all right? And the prophet's here looking this way. And often what happens is they see one mountain peak, but there's a whole range. And so what's a really just helpful tip to think about in terms of when you see the future being predicted in prophets is to ask, was this fulfilled in the exile and the return? Because some prophecies are fulfilled there. Or is it fulfilled in Jesus' first coming? Or is it going to be fulfilled in Jesus' second coming? Because often, sometimes in the prophets, what looks like one thing might actually have layers of fulfillment to it. And just as a really helpful tip to keep in mind. So again, just when we're thinking about the genre of the prophets, whenever you start a prophetic book, you want to be thinking, can I understand a bit of who he's talking to and what's going on? I want to make sure I've got in the back of my brain the covenant and understanding why this is going to be such a big deal. And then as I think about the future, I want to be thinking about where is this fulfilled? And just keeping that in mind is really going to help you in kind of getting into the prophets. So this is more kind of big picture, but it's helpful as we start into a book to have this kind of background. Any just questions on this before I pause to get us into a different thing here?
Is it ever like all three?
Yeah, it can definitely be all three. So like, I think it's Ezekiel 34, where he talks about, and he's kind of condemning the false shepherds, the bad leaders of Israel at the time. And he promises how he's going to come and be their shepherd, and he's going to return them to the land, and they'll dwell in peace and all this. Well, on one hand, like it's fulfilled in the exile and return from exile, right? They do get to come back to the land. But it's not perfect. They still have enemies, so clearly it's not fully fulfilled there. And then you've got, well, Jesus is the good shepherd that comes, right, to rescue them. So you got that in a sense in the first coming. But again, like the language of how amazing it's going to be, and they'll be eating from the tree of life. You're like, well, that didn't happen in Jesus' first coming, but that sure sounds like Revelation. So you've got this sense of like there's multiple layers here. Yep. So that can happen frequently. So, yep. Any other kind of questions on just genre of Old Testament prophets? Yep.
How do you, maybe this is off topic,
Yep.
so tell me if it is, but how do you discern that well? Because there's some prophetic stuff.
Yep.
Some people say, nope, it was absolutely done.
Yep.
Others like, nope, it's not done yet till like
Yep.
10 times. How
Yep.
do you discern?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think if you're thinking about multiple layers, it could be multiple things, right? And sometimes I think some people get too fixed on just one of them and miss that maybe there's like layers. Like if you think about a good author, sometimes they'll have like a scene early in the book, but then like later after you finish the book, you come back to like, oh, there were layers to this scene. Like, yes, I understood what was happening, but there was more layers to it, right? But the main thing I would just say is like, let the New Testament guide you as much as you can. So look at how the New Testament is trying to make sense of the prophets. That's going to be a big help. And we'll talk a bit more about this when we get to Christ connection. But as much as we can let the text of the New Testament guide us in the Old Testament, that's going to help us, right? And then if we're not sure, maybe we should just hold our opinions loosely, right? Like, my best sense is this, but maybe that's not a hill worth dying on if it's not super clear in the text, right?